We continue in our sermon series on the book of Nehemiah, and today we look at chapter 6 and chapter 7. Now, if you have not gone into our Google Drive, I want to encourage you to do that. It has the study materials as well as the sermon slides from the last few weeks for the sermon series. And you may find this week's guide especially helpful to understand the genealogy that was included in the assigned text today. So there's a bit of extra reading that you can find on the study material that will help you as we look at why did Nehemiah include that genealogy in Nehemiah. And our assigned text today is really long. It's 2 chapters from chapter 6 and 7. So I'll just be reading for us this morning from Nehemiah chapter 6 verse 15 to chapter 7 verse 4. So turn in your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 6 verse 15, and we're reading for us to chapter 7 verse 4. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that the work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. Also they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. And Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid. Chapter 7. Now when the walls had been built, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem, for he was a more faithful and God-fearing man than many. And I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they are still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some in front of their own homes. The city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know, scholars suggest that the 25th day of the month of Elul would likely have been 2nd of October. In fact, the New Living Translation just states that the wall was finished on the 2nd of October. And so rather abruptly, in the midst of the narrative of conflict and opposition, Nehemiah just plainly states the wall was finished. In the midst of great opposition, in the pain of struggle, the wall was finished. Now, the verses preceding our text suggest that the enemies were actually escalating their attacks on Nehemiah. In fact, they were now at this point not merely content to stop the rebuilding, they were plotting to kill Nehemiah himself. But within this narrative, we see Nehemiah's words so matter-of-factly, the wall was finished. Now, in finishing the wall, we can see God's favor at work. We can see God's favor at work. Now, I think it goes almost without saying that Nehemiah and the people of Israel enjoyed God's favor in the rebuilding of the wall. Now, time and again, throughout the first 6 chapters of Nehemiah, we read of how seemingly insurmountable challenges and opposition were overcome, not simply because of Nehemiah's intelligence or effort, but by the amazing favor of God. From Nehemiah being granted leave to travel to Jerusalem, to the resources he received from the king, from the unity, the courage of the people, to the thwarting of the plots of the enemies, God's divine favor can clearly be observed throughout the narrative. Now, in the verses we've just read, God's favor comes across in this mere 52 days it took to complete the work. And even if you explain away the speed of the work itself, because they were maybe very hardworking, they worked throughout the night, even if you explain away those 52 days, you would still have to recognize that it took just 6 months. It took just 6 months from the time Nehemiah received the permission from the king to travel to Jerusalem to this point in chapter 6, when the wall was finished. Now let me just put that into perspective for us. Several appointments ago, I was involved in a church upgrading project. Now this is not a rebuilding, it was an upgrading project. It took us way more than 6 months just to appoint the architects, put together the plans, raise the budget, put out the tenders, and all of that without even the first hammer being swung. More than 6 months just to get the tenders out, get the LCC to agree this is the right color for the walls. And it took more than 6 months, but it took Nehemiah just 6 months for the entire project. And all of that was accomplished without computers, emails, mobile phones, trucks, power drills, and bulldozers, and all the modern construction equipment, because he had one thing. He had God's favor. Now in this chapter, Nehemiah tells us that even the opposition were awestruck at this evident manifestation of God's power, for they perceived that this work was accomplished with the help of God. That's what it says in Nehemiah chapter 6 verse 16, that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Now, especially those who had taken the lead to oppose Nehemiah, they were demoralized at their loss of faith. Not only had their malicious plans not worked, their mocking and taunts have failed, their wall has been completed in record time. But listen to this, Nehemiah never once had to retaliate against the enemy. He never had to attack the opposition, but his enemies now stood humiliated before him. It has to be God's favor. I'm reminded of Psalm 20 verse 7, which says, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of our Lord, our God. They collapse and they fall, but we rise and stand upright because of God's favor. But perhaps it's important for us to take a little bit of a closer look. Who are the enemies? Now, in our text that we've just read today, it seems like Tobiah was one of the main actors behind the attacks. But throughout the book of Nehemiah, we will learn of 3 enemies who are named: Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. Now, they used various ploys in their attempt to disrupt the work of the Jews. We learn that they sought to harm Nehemiah. They sought to intimidate him with fake news. They deceived him with false prophets. They sought to influence the nobles of Judah. Now, that Tobiah is named so prominently in this chapter may give us a clue into who this person is and his significant role in undermining Nehemiah. Now, firstly, from the name Tobiah, we can infer that this guy was likely a Jew, or at least someone who followed God, Yahweh, because Tobiah in Hebrew means Yahweh is my good. So God is good, basically. And his son's name that we read earlier, Jehohanan, means Yahweh has shown mercy. And this name actually became increasingly common among the Jews towards the New Testament time and became the name that you and I are familiar with, John. That's the same name. Now, in addition, we have evidence from Nehemiah chapter 13 that Elishib, the high priest, was related to Tobiah. And one of his grandsons was the son-in-law of Sanballat. Now, this suggests to us that Tobiah was perhaps the most insidious of all of Nehemiah's enemies. You know why? Because Nehemiah was one of them. Nehemiah was one of their own. He wasn't a foreigner. He was one of their own. Yet he sought to undermine and attack the work that they were doing. And that's why Pastor Loretta's message 2 weeks ago is such a powerful reminder for us. That when we are faced with challenges, ridicules, and taunts, that our response is in our confidence in God. In prayer, to have perspective that God is bigger and stronger than our enemies, and to persevere against the opposition. And that was exactly how Nehemiah responded. He did not respond by causing disunity amongst the people. Rather than fear or worry or seek revenge, Nehemiah took the matter not in his own hands, but he took the matter to God. He goes to God in prayer and he asks God to remember. He asked God to remember Tobiah and Sanballat because of the things that they had done. Because ultimately, it is God who will bring justice. It is God who will bring justice. Now, friends, are you struggling against an enemy? Are you struggling against an enemy? You know, I made a joke at our LCC meeting about close now, maybe a month ago. It's really a joke, okay? I mean, maybe a funny, weird joke, but I made a joke as I was sharing about Nehemiah. You know, as we've been going through this book of Nehemiah, we've been studying it, and we've been, you know, looking at this text. And personally, I spent some time doing that. And as I've been reading the passage, I kept asking God, so who, God, is my enemy? Who is my enemy? Now, the more I think about it, the more I consider this question, the only conclusion that I come to, that my enemy is church leaders. It's a joke, really. But you know, some of us seated here today, it's not so funny. Maybe we are facing insurmountable challenges and opposition. Maybe your enemy is not people or persons. Maybe it's a sickness, cancer, or circumstances. Would you trust in the name of the Lord, who will give you favor and victory? But maybe for some of us, the enemy is the enemy that is within. You're facing opposition in ministry, in your life group, in your church, in our church. Maybe there are relationships that are hurting. You feel bitter, jealous, angry, and you are tempted to retaliate. You know, Nehemiah's suggestion for us today is for us to trust in the name of the Lord, who will give us favor and justice. Perhaps some of us in this, economic situation, we're frightened, we're worried, we're afraid because your job is threatened, you can't seem to pay off your debts, you are lonely, you're sad. Would you trust in the name of the Lord, who will give you favor and security? Perhaps it's the opposition of compromise in areas of sexuality in our nation. That will we as a church in Singapore trust in the name of the Lord, not in our eloquence, not in the power of influence, but may we trust in the name of the Lord to give us the favor to preserve the fabric of godly values in Singapore. So friends, we can see God's favor at work for Nehemiah. As God called Nehemiah and as he responded faithfully to that call, we see God's favor at work. So much so that the people were able to finish building the wall in record time. But not only do we see God's favor, we also see those who are at work. God's faithful who are at work. Now we read in Nehemiah chapter 7, in verse 2, that Nehemiah gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem, for he was a more faithful and God-fearing man than many. Now, we read in verses 2 and 3 that after the wall had been built, these verses that you see on the screen, Nehemiah puts his brother Hanani in charge of Jerusalem. Now these, he says, were faithful men who feared God. Now commentators are actually divided on whether Nehemiah meant only Hanani was a faithful man, or he was referring to both Hanani and Hananiah. Now whatever the case, Nehemiah made it clear that these persons that he appointed were faithful men. Now, I'm not sure if you recognize the significance of this or even remember the name Hanani, but this is the same Hanani, Nehemiah's brother, who was the one who informed Nehemiah about the state of the broken walls in chapter 1, verse 2 of Nehemiah. Let me tell you that he was appointed, Nehemiah appointed Hanani, not because he was Nehemiah's brother, but because Hanani had stayed the cause. You know, Hanani had remained faithful with Nehemiah since day one, through challenges and oppositions, and now Nehemiah could trust him to be faithful to the task of ruling and defending Jerusalem. Now, we do not just see God's faithful in these two individuals that Nehemiah appoints, but we also see later on in chapter 7 a whole list of people who have returned, people who were faithful to God. And that's where the rest of chapter 7 comes in. The recollection of those who have been faithful in God's call to return, those who had come in the first group of returnees from the exile and rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls, and now they are called to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, so that the city of God may once again shine as a light for people to come and worship the one true God. You know, I know a pastor from another country who has been in ministry for about 20 over years. Now, some years ago, I shared a meal with him when he visited Singapore, and I had breakfast with him. And as part of that conversation, he shared, and I was really taken aback by this, because he shared that he had not received salary for the last 20 years of his ministry. Now, I've known him for a long time. I never knew that he had not, for the last 20 years, received a salary. He had been living by faith for the last 20 years, trusting the Lord to provide for all his needs. Now, I'm not saying stop paying your pastors. Not the point of what I'm trying to say. But he shared with me that along the way, as he started ministry, as he was a young man preparing to get married, the church had informed him that they did not have money to keep him on the payroll. So they gave him an option to leave the church and find another job. As he prayed with his future wife at that point, they discerned and felt God's call to stay faithful to that original calling that they have had to pastor at that church. And so he went to the elders of his church and told them that he will continue his ministry in faith, that God will provide for all his needs. And now 20 over years later, he told me he has, and I know his sons, he's got 2 grown-up sons who love and fear the Lord, sons who had finished university, have good jobs. He has 3 grandchildren. He owns his own home. He drives a comfortable car, and all of this over the last 20 years, not having drawn a salary from his employer. And he showed me, opened his Bible, and he pointed me to Psalm 37. It says, trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, as your justice as the noonday. Verse 25, I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, or his children begging for bread. He is ever lending generously, and his children become a blessing. And as he finished those words, he looked at me and said, Jeremy, that is my life. That is my life. That's me. That's what the psalmist was talking about. For 20 years, I have lived by faith. The journey has not been easy. There have been struggles, but time and again, God has proven that he is faithful to those who will be faithful to him. He is faithful to those who will trust in him. He is faithful to those who will put their lot 100% fully in his goodness. You see, friends, it wasn't just that Hanani was faithful. It's because God's favor had proven to them time and again that his faithfulness is with those who are faithful. You see, friends, it is not about what we can do, how clever we are, how intelligent we are, how much resources we can get our hands to. It is about a faithful God who grants us his favor. You know, at the height of the pandemic, I remember speaking to many of my friends who were struggling with their jobs. You know, they were facing possible retrenchments. They were concerned about how things were going. And I remember having these conversations with them, and as we speak, I constantly felt my spirit asking them this same question. And this question is this, you know, friend, who was your provider before the pandemic? And most of them, you know, will say, God. So then I asked them, then who is your provider now in the midst of these circumstances? It is still God. You see, the same God who has been faithful in the past is the God who will be faithful into the future. Our call is not to worry about tomorrow. Our call is not to be anxious about whether we can complete the calling that God puts on us. Our jobs, our focus is to be faithful to the call that God has placed upon us. Friends, I know many of us here, maybe we have become tired. Some of us, perhaps we've been serving God for a really long time and we've become tired, jaded, because maybe like me, you were thinking, who's my enemy? Oh, my enemy, church leaders. And maybe some of you as life group leaders, and you're asking, who is my enemy? And you think, that member is my enemy. But you know, God isn't calling us to solve all the problems. God is calling us to stay the cause, be faithful, trust him, for he will bring his work to completion. Our job is to stay the cause. You know, Nehemiah at this point was reminded again as he appoints Hanani and Hananiah. He is reminded again of why he was rebuilding the wall. You know, on the outset, and I said this before, on the outset it seems like the job was building the physical wall, but Nehemiah's task is actually so much more than that. His task, even though on the outside was to build the wall, his task was to bring God's people together in this point of history to rebuild the people of God. His job was to rebuild God's family. Now we see this in chapter 7 verse 4. He writes this, the city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. See, one of the major problems was the small population in this large city of Jerusalem. Now, most of the Jews had returned. They settled mainly in the rural areas, and we are told here not enough houses were being built. Now, this line seems a little bit difficult, a little bit awkward to interpret. Some scholars proposed, and I agree with this proposal, that the word houses can be taken to mean families. And this is legitimate because throughout the Old Testament we read about the house of so-and-so, and that always points to families. And perhaps Nehemiah now is using this word as a euphemism and saying that not enough houses, yes, physical homes, not enough homes have been rebuilt, but these homes represents the families that God is calling to repopulate the city. And so we read in verse 5 that God literally inspired him. God put into his heart that he is to restate the book of genealogy that he had found, to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. Now, why do this? Now, it is important as we think about this, about how God inspired him, about God giving him, putting this in his heart, that often when we think about the work of God, for example, in building the tabernacle, you know, the artisans, we are told that in Exodus that they were filled with the Spirit. Even though they were building a physical object, they were filled with the Spirit. we were told that in the early church, for example, that wise men were, they were appointed to wait on tables in the early church in Acts chapter 6. And these men who were waiting on tables were filled with the Spirit. Here we see Nehemiah suggesting to us that God gave him an inspiration through the Spirit to put together the record of those who have returned to Jerusalem. Why? Because Nehemiah wanted to establish God's family as the people in Jerusalem who will become the worshippers, who will continue the work of rebuilding Jerusalem and rebuilding the city where God's worship will be conducted for generations to come. You see, putting together the genealogy, even though it's administrative, was actually the work of the Spirit. That as Nehemiah comes together, he isn't just building a physical wall, he is rebuilding God's family. As we come to this point of the book of Nehemiah, and we've got one more sermon next week that Janine will bring to us, and we'll take a little break from Nehemiah after that as we celebrate our church anniversary. But as we come to this point of the book of Nehemiah, as we look at this completion, the finishing of the wall, it almost seems like the job is done. Yet there's so much more in Nehemiah to go on. Why? Because the task that Nehemiah has been given is so much more than just rebuilding physical walls. It's to rebuild God's family, to rebuild the family of God who will worship. What does that mean for us today? I think we can take away a few things from this passage of scripture that we've read today. The first is this: if God has called you and spoken to you in the past, would you trust that God will grant you the favor to complete his call? Earlier Theophilus led us in worship, and he we didn't plan this, and he said, if there's a prayer that you've been praying for and you've given up on it, would you offer it once again to God? Now, I felt in my spirit, and this was exactly what I was thinking of as I was preparing this message, that perhaps there are dreams that God has put into our church, into the members of our congregation, into our leaders, into those who have been serving in the church. God has placed dreams, visions, calls that have died over the years. And God is calling us to bring resurrection and new life to those dreams, to trust that God will give us the favor, God will give you the favor to complete his call. I think there's some of us here who have let those dreams die. Maybe there's some of us here who have received a call into full-time ministry, full-time vocational Christian ministry, and we have let that call die because the circumstances were just too hard, because the opposition was just too strong, because the people around us were just too difficult, and we have let those dreams and those callings die. I believe that God is calling you today to bring resurrection and new life to those callings, to trust that God will grant you the favor to complete his call. But there are also those of us who are tired. We're still on the journey. We're still fighting on. And God is calling us today to be faithful to God's call, to be faithful, but not just in the calling, but to be faithful in our worship in the face of opposition. That perhaps because of the opposition, we've been tempted to retaliate. We've been tempted to strike back, to take revenge. Maybe it's in your workplace. Maybe when you joined the company, you felt God calling you to be the salt and light for this organization, that you will bring about the love of Jesus into your organization. And over the years, you have remained faithful, but it has been getting harder and harder. People have been coming against you. It's harder to love them. It's harder to be that salt and that light to bring a positive influence into your team, into your organization. Maybe those who are attacking you are fellow Christians even. And you've been struggling with it, and God is calling you today. Would you stay faithful? Would you not give up? Would you hang in there? Because God will give you the favor as you remain faithful. But finally, for us as a church today, as we stand at the cusp of celebrating our 10th anniversary, I want to challenge you and call you to stand up and be counted to be part of God's family here at HVMC. Perhaps you've been worshiping at our church for the last 10 years, but you've never become a member. Please, now is the time. Sign up for the next membership class. If you have been worshiping in the church for a long time, you've never been baptized, please, now is the time. Stand up to be counted to be part of God's family. But more than that, I want us to consider why we are here at ACS International. Why has God called us as a church to be here on the campus of ACS International? You know, for Nehemiah, he didn't have to travel all the way back to Jerusalem to worship God. Let's just make that clear. The exilic community of faith was a vibrant worshiping community. The synagogues that were set up in the time of the exiles were places of worship where Jews, the Jews in the diaspora, the exiles, they came together to worship the Lord regularly and faithfully. In fact, many scholars tell us that much of the Old Testament scripture that we have today was formed and put together by those who were in exile, not those who were living as remnants in the land of Jerusalem. Nehemiah did not have to return to Jerusalem to worship God. Let's make that clear. He had a community, a vibrant community of people amongst the exiles who were faithful worshipers of God. But he had a call to go to a physical place to rebuild physical walls after rebuilding a physical temple so that God's people can return to worship. There is something there for us to consider. That where we are matters. It's not just about the God who is everywhere, omnipresent, of course. Certainly, we can worship God everywhere. You can worship God in your car, and certainly some of us, since the pandemic, we've been worshiping God in our beds, and that's fine. But you can worship God anywhere. But why are we here? What is God calling us as HVMC, the family of God at HVMC here in ACS International? What is God calling us here to do? What is our purpose? Why are we here? As we come to our 10th anniversary in July, just a couple of weeks away, I think we ought to think about that. We ought to take time to reflect. Why are we here? What is God's call and mission for us here on the campus? Perhaps it's time for us to bring new life into the dreams and the visions of those who planted this church from the time of a preaching point. Perhaps it's time to bring resurrection, to bring back to life those dreams, those visions for why we started this church. And that's why one of our directions, of course, this year is to review our ministry to ACS International. But more than that, I think each and every one of us need to think and review in our own hearts why you are in HVMC. Because the answer to that question will help us rebuild not just the physical parts of the church, the worship services, but it will help us to rebuild our purpose as God's family together in this place. I invite the team to come up even as we close. I wanted to share with us a story that I heard from my mom, and she heard this from someone else. So this is not the story that comes from me, but I heard this story a while ago, and it was really encouraging. And this was a story of a man who was called to be a missionary, and he was this was before the days of transatlantic flights, and the only way he could go from Europe, where he was living, to America, where he felt called to be a missionary, was to take a long boat ride across the Atlantic. And so this man wasn't very wealthy. He didn't really have much support, but he felt this call to be a missionary so strongly that he said he had to go no matter the cost. And so he saved up. He sold every one of his possessions. He saved up as much as he could. He put it all together, and just enough to pay for that boat ride across the Atlantic. But he thought he had enough for the passage, but he had no money to buy food on the ship. And so he began to ask friends for bread and crackers and cheese and whatever long life things that he could keep. And he collected all that, put all that in his suitcase, and went onto the ship, believing that God's call for him to go to America, to be a missionary, that what he has in that small suitcase of crackers and cheese will be enough to sustain him for the entire journey. And along the way, as he boarded on the first day, he saw this beautiful dining room on the ship, and he saw all kinds of people going into that dining room to have their meal. And he was full of envy, but there was nothing else he could do. He couldn't afford the meals, and so every day he would go into his room, sit in a corner, and he would just eat his bread and his cheese and his crackers. Okay, this was before cheese and crackers was a luxurious thing. Okay, so he would just get by with whatever food he had. But over the days of the voyage, the cheese became moldy, the bread became stale, and it just got worse and worse. And every day he was hungry, and he looked into that dining room, that beautiful dining room, and people were having a feast. They were coming out of their dining room saying, "We've had so much to eat, we are so full, we're gonna vomit." And just like how it is when you go for those cruises. And he got sadder and sadder. He was thinking in his heart, "God, how could you do this to me? I want to be a faithful missionary. I have put everything together to do this, and how could you do this to me? How come all these people are, having such a good time, and I'm suffering here?" And so one day before he was due to arrive in New York and to disembark, he thought he could take it no longer. He went to the chef, he went to the cook actually right behind the kitchen, and he saw that he was pouring out some leftovers, and he went to him and said, "Sir, I've been really hungry this entire voyage. I haven't eaten anything except bread, stale cheese and crackers. Could you just give me some of these leftovers for a meal?" And this chef or this kitchen hand looked at him with great surprise, and he looks at him and says, "Sir, sure, no problem, but do you have a ticket?" And this man replies, "Sure, of course I have a ticket. I'm not some stowaway. I'm here legitimately. This is my ticket." And the chef says to him, "Well, sir, then you're entitled to eat for free at the dining room." Now imagine that. He had gone through the entire voyage starving because he didn't realize that his ticket entitled him to all the food that he could have eaten in the dining hall. Friends, this story reminds us that if God calls, He will provide. But sometimes we are too clever for ourselves, and we overthink things. We think that our job is to come up with a grand strategy, to come up with a grand plan to solve all of God's problems for Him. But He gives to us more than what we need to finish the work that He has called us to. And I believe that God's favor is with those who are God's faithful